The desert wind whispered secrets, but the water held a confession. One afternoon, beneath the blistering Arizona sun, a man rode to a secluded lake, seeking only to quench his horse's thirst. Instead, he found a woman emerging from the cool depths, her modesty stolen, her eyes wide with terror and a vulnerability that would forever change his quiet world. It was a sight he shouldn't have seen, a connection he shouldn't have made. In a town where law was a shield for darkness and whispers carried more weight than bullets, some bonds are forged in desperation. Some desires burn brighter than any desert sun. And some secrets, well, some secrets have a way of tearing everything apart. Before we dive into this tale of longing and peril, tell us in the comments below, where are you watching Whispers of the West from today? Now, step into Dry Creek, 1879, where shadows stretch long and loyalties are tested. The scorching sun beat down on Dry Creek, baking the earth to a fine, reddish dust that coated everything in a gritty veneer. This wasn't a town that thrived. It merely endured. Its wooden structures, bleached and warped by relentless exposure, huddled together around a main street carved by wagon wheels and restless hooves. The air, thick with the scent of stale whiskey, horse sweat, and simmering resentment, hinted at a tension rarely spoken but always felt, a current of unease running just beneath the surface of everyday life. At the heart of this parched domain stood Sheriff Harold McCoy, an imposing figure whose broad shoulders and piercing, unyielding gaze projected an image of absolute authority. His star-emblazoned chest seemed less a symbol of justice and more a badge of unquestionable power. He spoke in clipped, measured tones, his words carrying the weight of command, and most folks in Dry Creek saw him as the unwavering pillar of order. Yet, for those brave enough to peer past the polished facade, a chilling darkness flickered behind his rigid smile, a predatory glint that promised swift, merciless retribution for any defiance. In the shadows of his formidable presence lived Clara McCoy, his wife. Her beauty was delicate, almost ethereal, a stark contrast to the harsh landscape. Her eyes, however, were windows to a profound sorrow, a quiet resignation that few dared to acknowledge, let alone question. She moved through the dusty streets like a ghost, her every gesture speaking of a life lived under a suffocating weight, a cage far more insidious than any iron bars. Her marriage to Harold was less a union of souls and more a gilded prison, its walls built of silent threats and unspoken fear. A few miles beyond the town's reach, where the scrub brush grew thicker and the silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the lonely calls of distant coyotes, Samuel Turner tended his ranch. He was a man etched by the desert, his hands calloused from a lifetime of labor, his face weathered by sun and wind. Samuel had known solitude since his wife's early passing, a profound quietness that had settled deep in his bones, making it feel an inevitable part of his existence. He was a rancher through and through, dedicated to his cattle and the land, a man of few words but resolute principles. He didn't seek trouble, nor did he interfere with the affairs of Dry Creek. Yet everyone knew that when push came to shove, Samuel Turner possessed a courage that few men could match. It was a silent understanding, a respect earned not by boasts, but by actions. It was on such an afternoon, a day when the sun hammered down with particular intensity, that Samuel rode his horse, Buster, towards the small, shimmering oasis of a secluded lake. The air was thick and still, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of Buster's hooves on the dry earth. He planned to let the animal drink deeply, then perhaps rest himself in the sparse shade of a gnarled mesquite tree before heading back to the ranch. As Buster dipped his muzzle into the cool, clear water, a desperate, choked cry ripped through the oppressive silence. Samuel's head snapped up, his hand instinctively going to the Colt holstered at his hip. His eyes scanned the reeds by the water's edge, then the dense thicket of willows further in. And then he saw her, emerging from the crystalline water, like a mirage in the heat haze, was Clara McCoy. Her long, dark hair, usually meticulously pinned, now clung in wet tendrils to her shoulders and back. Her delicate frame was barely concealed by her hands and arms, which she frantically pressed against herself in a desperate attempt to cover her nakedness. Her face was flushed with profound shame and gasping exertion. Her eyes, wide with terror and humiliation, fixed on him. "Please, please, rancher, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of the water. They stole my clothes." Samuel froze, a wave of shock washing over him. Clara, the sheriff's wife, here, naked. The situation was surreal, an impossible tableau painted against the brutal backdrop of the desert. He saw the tremble in her lips, the desperate plea in her eyes, and a primal sense of honor, long buried beneath layers of solitude, stirred within him. His embarrassment was immediate, a hot flush that crept up his neck, but it was quickly overshadowed by a protective instinct, a raw compassion for her plight. Without a word, Samuel dismounted. His gaze remained respectfully averted, fixed on a point just beyond her shoulder. He shrugged off his heavy, worn leather duster, its dark material smelling of dust, horse, and honest labor. The heat was stifling, but he ignored it, holding the coat out towards her with a steady hand. "Here, ma'am," he rumbled, his voice rough but kind. "Cover yourself." Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes flickering from the coat to Samuel's face, then back to the garment. The moment stretched, fraught with unspoken emotion. Then, with a tearful nod, she reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the coat. The leather was warm from his body, a surprising comfort against her chilled skin. She quickly wrapped it around herself, pulling it tight, its oversized form engulfing her, offering a semblance of privacy and safety. Their eyes met then properly for the first time. In that shared glance, amidst the dust and the silence, a profound and dangerous shift occurred. It wasn't just a gesture of compassion, nor merely a moment of shared embarrassment. It was the ignition of something entirely new, silent yet searing. A spark that landed not only on their skin but deep within their souls, awakening a connection forbidden by every convention in Dry Creek. A tether that promised both solace and unimaginable peril. The desert, an eternal witness, seemed to hold its breath. The days after the lake encounter draped Dry Creek in a strange, heightened silence. Clara McCoy, trapped in the oppressive shadow of Sheriff Harold McCoy's rigid authority, found her thoughts constantly drifting to Samuel Turner. The memory of his quiet strength, the rough feel of his duster, was a stark contrast to the stifling emptiness of her marriage, a fragile hope in her gilded cage. Harold remained oblivious, his grip on the town and his wife unwavering, further fueling Clara's desperate yearning for any solace. Miles away, on his secluded ranch, Samuel found his hard-won solitude profoundly disturbed. The image of Clara emerging from the water, vulnerable and desperate, haunted him. He was a man of the land, wary of entanglements, especially one that could ignite the sheriff's fury. Such a connection was a death sentence in these arid lands. Yet he couldn't shake her from his mind. Her sorrowful eyes had etched themselves into his memory, stirring a protective instinct that defied logic and reason. He knew the peril, but the undeniable pull, a magnetic force born of compassion and a shared, dangerous moment, drew him inexorably closer. Soon, Clara manufactured an excuse. Under the pretext of buying milk and cheeses for the sheriff's household, a duty Harold rarely questioned, she began making furtive visits to Samuel's ranch. Each ride was a calculated risk, a stolen breath of freedom. Samuel, initially hesitant, aware of the ever-present danger, found himself unable to resist her quiet charm and profound vulnerability. Their early conversations skimmed the surface, masked by talk of cattle and crops, but beneath the mundane words, a profound connection blossomed. Clara confided in him, sharing glimpses of her suffocating life, the chilling silence of her home, Harold's insidious control. Samuel listened intently, his gaze unwavering, seeing past the sheriff's wife to the woman yearning for escape. He, in turn, shared the quiet solitude of his own life, the echoes of a love lost too soon. These whispered confidences, these stolen glances, burned with a longing hotter than any desert sun. The air between them crackled with unspoken desires, a dangerous, magnetic pull growing stronger with each passing day. Samuel wrestled with his honor, but Clara's fragile beauty and the deep sadness in her eyes proved irresistible. Then, one late afternoon, as Clara arrived at the ranch for another visit, the clear blue sky betrayed them. A sudden, ominous shift swept across the western horizon, turning the sky a bruised, angry purple. The air grew eerily still, then erupted. A low rumble of thunder reverberated across the vast expanse, and the wind, a gentle sigh moments before, shrieked to life, tearing through the mesquite trees. "Get inside, Clara!" Samuel shouted, rushing to her as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. He helped her quickly secure her mare, then ushered her into his small, sturdy cabin. They barely made it inside before the skies truly broke open, rain hammering down on the tin roof with relentless fury. Samuel moved swiftly, securing the heavy wooden door with a resolute thud, plunging the cabin into a dim, intimate twilight. He latched the rattling windows as the wind outside howled like a ravenous beast. The world beyond their walls dissolved into a chaotic maelstrom of sound and primal power. The sudden silence within the cabin, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain and the furious shriek of the wind, was profound. It amplified their proximity, their rapid breaths. Clara stood near the door, her dress clinging damply to her, her hair, freed by the wind, framing a face etched with a mix of fear and desperate longing. Samuel, having secured the last window, turned back to her. His eyes, usually guarded, now held a raw, exposed yearning. He tried to look away, but her gaze, filled with a quiet desperation, drew him back. The air between them crackled, charged with every unspoken word, every shared secret, the storm outside mirroring the tempest raging within their hearts. Slowly, Clara took a step forward, then another, her eyes never leaving his. She was tired of the fear, tired of the pretense, tired of her suffocating life. Here, isolated from the judgmental world of Dry Creek, in the heart of the storm, she felt a profound, dangerous liberation. Her trembling hand reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was an electric jolt, dissolving his carefully constructed resistance. Samuel's breath hitched. He had spent his life building walls, but this woman, with her quiet strength and heartbreaking vulnerability, had breached them all. When their eyes met again, there was no turning back. The unspoken words rushed into the void, a torrent of desperate longing. She closed the last fraction of distance, her body pressing softly against his. Her head tilted up, her gaze locking with his, a silent plea that echoed the roar of the wind. The kiss was urgent, raw, and desperate. It was a collision of two souls starved for connection, for tenderness, for escape. His lips were rough against hers, tasting of dust and the unspoken years of solitude. Her hands rose, gripping his shoulders, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. It was a kiss born of desperation, fueled by a forbidden desire that had simmered too long, finally erupting. Amidst its ferocity, there was an unexpected tenderness, a fragile hope. In that moment, surrounded by chaos, their fates were irrevocably sealed. The forbidden romance, ignited by a stolen duster and a desperate plea, had now fully awakened, a dangerous, beautiful storm of its own. There was no going back. The storm, having raged with primal fury, eventually gave way to a fragile dawn. But within Samuel's small cabin, a different kind of storm had settled, one of awakening passion and undeniable intimacy. The hurried, desperate kiss had blossomed into something profound, forging a bond that now tethered Clara and Samuel together, a dangerous, beautiful defiance against the arid landscape and the oppressive shadow of Dry Creek. With their love consummated, Clara's visits to the ranch took on a new, urgent meaning. Each stolen moment was a lifeline, a shared secret that both thrilled and terrified them. She found solace in Samuel's presence, a quiet understanding that offered a stark contrast to the suffocating oppression of Harold McCoy's home. But as their forbidden romance deepened, Samuel's keen eyes, sharpened by years of observing the subtle shifts of the desert, began to pick up on discordant notes in the familiar rhythm of Dry Creek. Late at night, when most of the town slept, a different kind of activity stirred. From the periphery of his infrequent trips to town for supplies, Samuel noticed the hushed movements around the sheriff's office. Dim lanterns would flicker within Harold McCoy's private sanctuary, illuminating the silhouettes of unfamiliar men, rough-hewn figures with shadowed faces and an air of quiet menace. Slipping in and out, wagons, often nondescript and covered, would pull up behind the office, heavy crates loaded or unloaded under the cloak of darkness. No one questioned it, at least not openly. The townsfolk, long accustomed to Harold's iron fist, turned a blind eye to anything that hinted at impropriety. But Samuel, now with Clara's fragile freedom at stake, saw the sinister pattern emerging. He recognized the furtive glances, the guarded movements, the way money exchanged hands without a trace. It reeked of something far dirtier than mere local politics. A cold dread began to settle in Samuel's gut, not just for himself, but for Clara. The sheriff, already a tyrant in his home, was clearly hiding something far more pervasive. His innate sense of justice, long tempered by solitude, now flared with a protective fire. He couldn't stand by. He wouldn't. He had to know the truth, not just for Dry Creek, but for the woman who had stirred his dormant heart and risked everything for him. One moonless night, Samuel decided to follow. He chose a horse known for its quiet hooves and its ability to blend with the dark. He waited patiently, hidden amongst the sparse foliage just outside town, until a familiar diligence, driven by one of Harold's known associates, a brutish man with shaggy red hair Samuel recognized as Earl Red Dawson, alongside the thin, shifty Tommy Snake Collins, pulled away from the sheriff's office. The wagon was heavily laden, its springs groaning under the weight of unseen cargo. Samuel kept a considerable distance, allowing the faint sounds of the wagon to guide him, disappearing into the vast, silent expanse of the desert. The diligence, instead of heading towards the established trade routes, veered sharply off the main trail, cutting a path towards the desolate, forgotten foothills where an abandoned silver mine had long since collapsed into disuse. The air grew colder as Samuel approached on foot, leaving his horse hidden a safe distance away. The mine entrance, a gaping maw in the side of the mountain, glowed faintly with lantern light. Crouching behind a cluster of thorny ocotillo, Samuel watched, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. What he saw made his blood run cold. Harold McCoy, his sheriff's badge glinting mockingly in the dim light, stood at the entrance, overseeing the frantic offloading of crates. Men, the same rough figures Samuel had seen in Dry Creek, moved with practiced efficiency. Barrels, unmistakably filled with illicit whiskey, were rolled into the mine's dark maw. And then he saw them, rifles, glinting dully as they were transferred from the wagon, their shapes unmistakable. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, dust, and something else, the undeniable stench of criminality. Harold's voice, usually clipped and authoritarian, was now laced with a chilling joviality as he barked orders, a stark contrast to the upright lawman he pretended to be. Earl Red Dawson moved with brutish efficiency, his powerful frame muscling the heavy crates, while Tommy Snake Collins, his thin frame hunched, scanned the surroundings with his characteristically suspicious eyes, a crooked smile occasionally playing on his lips. It wasn't merely petty corruption. This was an operation vast and insidious. Harold McCoy wasn't just bending the law. He was shattering it, using his badge as a shield to protect a burgeoning criminal empire built on contraband weapons and illicit spirits. The realization hit Samuel with the force of a physical blow. The sheriff, the very symbol of law in Dry Creek, was a kingpin of smugglers, dealing in death and forbidden goods. He understood, with terrifying clarity, the true depth of Harold's depravity. He also understood the precariousness of their situation. He and Clara were now inextricably caught in a web far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined, a web spun by a man who wielded power with ruthless impunity. The desert night, once a canvas for stolen kisses, now felt like a shroud, heavy with the weight of this terrible truth. The chilling truth of Harold McCoy's corruption, unearthed in the desolate shadows of the abandoned mine, weighed heavily on Samuel. It was a poison, seeping into the fragile sanctuary of his newfound love, threatening to shatter everything. He had to tell Clara, but the prospect of tearing down the last vestiges of her already fragile world filled him with a profound dread. He knew the depths of her suffering under Harold's roof, but this revelation would expose the very foundation of her misery as a lie, a cruel deception perpetuated by the man sworn to protect her. He waited for her next visit, the hours stretching into an unbearable eternity. When Clara finally rode up to his ranch, her face alight with a mixture of apprehension and the quiet joy of their stolen moments, Samuel saw the hope in her eyes, the burgeoning freedom he had helped awaken. It made the bitter confession all the harder. They sat at his small, sturdy kitchen table, the familiar scent of wood smoke and coffee filling the air, a stark contrast to the darkness Samuel was about to unleash. He began slowly, carefully, recounting his clandestine surveillance, the late-night visits to the sheriff's office, the heavy wagons, and finally, the horrifying scene at the abandoned mine. He described the barrels of whiskey, the gleam of smuggled rifles, Harold's chillingly jovial command, and the sinister presence of Earl Red Dawson and Tommy Snake Collins. Clara listened, her delicate features initially hardening into disbelief. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice barely audible. "It can't be. Harold, he's the sheriff. He swore to uphold the law." The words were a desperate plea, a futile attempt to cling to the last tattered shreds of her perception of order. The man who had promised to protect her, to provide for her, could not possibly be a criminal mastermind, a tyrant cloaked in the badge of authority. Her denial was visceral, a defense mechanism against a truth too painful to bear. Samuel reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. His gaze was steady, unwavering, filled with a deep, sorrowful certainty. "Clara, I saw it with my own eyes. He's not just bending the law, he's breaking it. He's building an empire out of contraband, using his badge as a shield." He spoke not with accusation, but with a weary conviction that left no room for doubt. Confronted with the raw sincerity in Samuel's eyes, the carefully constructed facade Clara had maintained for years began to crack. Her initial disbelief gave way to a dawning, terrible realization. A tremor ran through her, then a full-body shudder. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down her face as she finally crumbled, the weight of her entire existence under Harold's thumb pressing down on her. I knew," she choked out, her voice breaking. "Not like this, not smuggling. But I suspected. The money, the whispered conversations, the way he would disappear at night." Her confession was a painful torrent. He controls everything. Every step I take, every word I say. He threatens me, Samuel. He makes it clear that if I ever betray him, he'd make an example of me. He said he'd ruin me, that I'd have nowhere to go. The words tumbled out, raw and painful, revealing years of unspoken torment. Harold hadn't just confined her within a marriage. He had held her captive with fear, with threats that echoed in the lonely halls of their home. Samuel listened, his heart aching with a fierce protectiveness. He saw the scars not on her skin, but deep within her spirit. The confession, though harrowing, was also a profound act of trust, a breaking of chains she had worn in silence for too long. In her vulnerability, he saw an immense courage. He held her tight, letting her tears soak into his shirt, offering the only comfort he could, his unwavering presence. As her sobs subsided, a fragile hope flickered in Clara's eyes. Looking at Samuel, truly looking at him, she understood. He saw her, not as property, not as an extension of another man's status, but as Clara, a woman with her own fears, her own dreams, her own desires. For the first time, a sliver of true freedom seemed within reach, a life where her worth was not dictated by the brutal will of her husband. She could breathe, truly breathe, beside this man who offered not control, but compassion. But the reprieve, the fleeting taste of hope and burgeoning happiness, was short-lived. Sheriff Harold McCoy, A man whose perception was as sharp as his temper was no fool. He might have been distracted by his illicit dealings, but the subtle shifts in his wife's demeanor did not escape his notice. He saw it in the lightness of her step, in the way her gaze, once always downcast or averted, now held a defiant glint he couldn't quite place. He felt it in the heavy silence that now hung between them, a silence far deeper and more charged than their usual strained quiet. The polite resignation that had once been her default had been replaced by an almost imperceptible spark, a hint of something forbidden blooming beneath his very nose. A festering suspicion began to take root in Harold's mind, slowly poisoning his thoughts. His possessive nature, always hovering just beneath the surface, surged to the forefront. He became a predator stalking his own prey. One afternoon, feigning a trip out of town, he doubled back, hiding his horse amongst the brush, and waited. He watched as Clara, under the guise of her usual errand, rode out of Dry Creek, not towards the market, but towards the remote path leading to Samuel Turner's ranch. The sight ignited a cold, insane fury in Harold's gut. The image of his wife, riding to another man, confirmed his darkest suspicions. He followed, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might shatter, his eyes burning with a dangerous madness. He saw them together, a glimpse of a tender embrace near Samuel's cabin, and the world seemed to narrow to a single point of incandescent rage. The defiance, the betrayal, the audacity of it all. It was more than an infidelity. It was an affront to his absolute authority, a direct challenge to his iron grip. The vengeance, when it came, would be swift and brutal. Harold rode back to Dry Creek, the desert wind a howl of fury in his ears, his mind already spinning with murderous intent. He would make an example. He would remind everyone who truly held power in this godforsaken land. He summoned Earl Red Dawson, his brutish, loyal enforcer with the tangled red hair, and Tommy Snake Collins, the thin, treacherous man with suspicious eyes and a crooked smile. They met in the dimly lit backroom of a saloon, the air thick with stale smoke and the scent of cheap liquor. Harold's face was a mask of cold fury, his voice low and menacing as he laid out his plan. "Tonight," he rasped, his eyes glinting like a madman's, "we're paying Samuel Turner a visit, and Clara will be there." His words were a death knell, sealing the fate of Dry Creek, and perhaps the illicit lovers. The stage was set. The ambush, fatal and unforgiving, would unfold under the merciless Arizona sky. The night arrived cloaked in a fury of its own. A violent tempest, mirroring the chaos brewing in their hearts, descended upon Dry Creek. Lightning cracked across the bruised, purple sky, illuminating the skeletal mesquite trees in stark, fleeting flashes. Thunder roared, a primal drumbeat echoing the frantic pulse in Samuel's chest. He had seen the darkening sky, felt the shift in the wind, and a cold certainty had settled within him. Harold was coming. At Samuel's secluded ranch, amidst the howling wind and drumming rain, Clara, oblivious to the imminent danger until Samuel's grim face told her everything, clung to him. Samuel, anticipating the inevitable confrontation with a grim resolve, moved with purpose. He led Clara to his small, sturdy bedroom, pushing her gently inside. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice firm, his eyes conveying an unspoken promise. "Don't come out, no matter what." He swiftly secured the door, the heavy latch clicking into place, a meager barrier against the coming storm. He then retrieved his trusty Winchester shotgun from above the fireplace, its polished wood feeling solid and familiar in his calloused hands. He loaded it with practiced efficiency, the metallic clack-clack of shells filling the tense silence between thunderclaps. He positioned himself near the main door, the ranch house, once a haven of solitude, now a fortress under siege. From the swirling darkness, 3 distinct figures emerged, their lanterns cutting dim arcs through the torrential downpour. Harold McCoy, his face a grim mask illuminated by the flashes of lightning, led his 2 brutish enforcers, Earl Red Dawson and Tommy Snake Collins. The heavy rain seemed to fuel Harold's insane fury, making his movements appear almost spectral. The sound of their boots on the muddy earth, usually muted by the storm, seemed to echo with sinister intent. The first crash ripped through the night, the main door of the ranch house splintering under a powerful kick. The ranch echoed with the sounds of forced entry, a brutal invasion of sacred ground. Red Dawson, a formidable shadow, lunged into the main room, his eyes scanning for Samuel. Behind him, Snake Collins slinked in, his lean frame moving with predatory stealth, disappearing towards the dark expanse of the barn, just as Harold strode through the shattered doorway, his pistol drawn, his face a canvas of murderous intent. Samuel moved first, a blur of grim determination. He didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, a deafening blast that briefly silenced the storm. Red Dawson, mid-stride, stumbled, a shocked gasp escaping his lips as he crumpled to the floor, his massive body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Harold, caught off guard by the swiftness of Samuel's action, snarled, leveling his pistol. But Samuel was already tracking the second threat. He pivoted, the shotgun swinging in a deadly arc. Another thunderous blast tore through the room. A strangled cry erupted from the darkness near the barn entrance, and Tommy Snake Collins, who had been attempting to flank Samuel, dropped, a silent heap, his treacherous smirk finally wiped from his face. The confrontation narrowed to just two men. Harold McCoy, the tyrannical sheriff, and Samuel Turner, the quiet rancher, pushed to his breaking point. Harold advanced down the short corridor towards the main room, his pistol held steady, his face, lit by the furious flashes of lightning, contorted with insane rage. "You'll pay for this, Turner," he snarled, his voice barely cutting through the storm. "And she will too." Behind the locked bedroom door, Clara had heard it all, the splintering wood, the terrifying blasts of the shotgun, Harold's furious roar. Fear, cold and consuming, gave way to a desperate, unyielding resolve. She couldn't stay hidden. She wouldn't. With a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, she threw herself against the flimsy door, again and again, until the protesting would give way with a final, splintering crack. Her eyes, wild with terror and a newfound courage, swept across the grim scene. Red and Snake unmoving on the floor, Samuel standing resolute with the smoking shotgun, and Harold, his pistol aimed, advancing. Clara rushed forward, her wet dress clinging to her, her hair flying wildly. She moved between Samuel and Harold, a desperate shield, her voice cutting through the roar of the storm, raw and guttural. "No!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain that had somehow found its way inside. Her gaze, filled with years of unspoken pain, locked onto Harold's. "I don't love you. I never loved you, Harold. I'm tired of living in fear." The words were a torrent of truth, a final, defiant release of all the terror and despair she had endured. Harold McCoy froze, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and incandescent fury. Her defiance, her outright rejection, in front of this man, was an unforgivable blasphemy. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure hatred. He raised his pistol, not at Samuel, but at Clara, his finger tightening on the trigger, a chilling resolve in his eyes. He would make good on his threat. But Samuel was faster. A primal instinct, honed by a life of hard choices and sharpened by a desperate love, surged through him. He fired. The shotgun roared one last, echoing time, its sound a final, brutal sentence. Harold McCoy staggered, a look of shocked disbelief freezing on his contorted face, before he fell to the dusty floor, his pistol clattering uselessly beside him. With him, the terror that had held Dry Creek in its iron grip for so long was finally silenced. The storm outside seemed to lessen, as if in recognition of the battle won. When the sun, a pale, hesitant disk, finally rose over Dry Creek the next morning, it cast long, weary shadows across the town. The news spread like wildfire. Sheriff Harold McCoy was dead. The official story, quickly crafted and whispered through the saloons and dusty streets, spoke of a fierce shootout with a band of dangerous contraband smugglers. A heroic, if tragic, end to a dedicated lawman. No one dared question it too closely. Dry Creek, accustomed to its uneasy peace, accepted the narrative without much protest. But Clara and Samuel carried the true story in the silence between them. She, now free, but forever marked by the blood shed, the years of abuse, and the terrible price of her liberation. He, burdened by the weight of lives taken, but with the woman who had become his redemption standing beside him. They did not linger. Dry Creek, for all its newfound peace, held too many ghosts, too many memories. Together, they turned their backs on the town, riding out into the vast, unforgiving desert. The sand stretched endlessly before them, a blank canvas for a new beginning. They knew the journey ahead would be long, fraught with uncertainty, and haunted by the echoes of what they had lost. But they also knew that in that desolate land, they had found something rare and precious. The chance to finally belong to each other. A hard-won freedom forged in the crucible of desperation and defiance. The dust of Dry Creek settled once more, but beneath its familiar blanket, the whispers had changed. A sheriff's badge lay tarnished, its authority shattered not by outlaws, but by the very corruption it concealed. In the brutal ballet of a stormy night, two souls found their freedom in a hail of gunfire, shedding the shackles of fear and deceit. Clara, released from her gilded cage, and Samuel, a man of honor forced to spill blood, rode away from the shadows, carrying the weight of their choices into the vast, indifferent desert. They had bought their chance at a new beginning, a fragile dawn earned at the highest price imaginable. In a world where law was often just a suggestion and loyalty a fleeting currency, the human heart, when pushed to its limits, can forge its own justice. Even in the harshest lands, love can bloom from desperation, but such blossoms often demand a sacrifice, leaving indelible marks upon those who dare to taste their forbidden fruit. Perhaps true freedom is never truly free. It is merely paid for in different, often bloodier, coin. What do you believe was the true cost of their freedom? Share your thoughts on Clara and Samuel's journey in the comments below. If the echoes of the Old West captivate your imagination, you won't want to miss our other tales of courage and consequence. Click here to delve deeper into the forgotten histories of the frontier. And if you're new to our dusty trails, remember to like this video and subscribe to Whispers of the West for more stories whispered from the heart of the wild.